So I posted something a while back, last week, saying our status page in pajamas is like a really good start for getting a better understanding as a designer, as a developer, for seeing how mature a component is and sort of seeing where are the gaps within the design system that I could potentially contribute as well, if I wanted to. So I really love the work. I think it was Jarek who sort of started to do this overview. And then sort of what I noticed with this is initially it was just the term complete, where I was just like, well, it never really feels like a component is complete. Things get updated, styles adapt, things change, you get new functionality and so on. So was there a more appropriate term for complete? And then I started like picking at the thread and realizing there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath here in terms of just product or component maturity that I needed to get into just because I'm like that. So I sort of said, look, this complete terminology is a little bit strange to me, but whilst we're at it, can we create like an issue and have a discussion at the high level about just our design system and maturity in general, and sort of talking about maturity naming, having a greater transparency on the potential areas for inconsistencies within our design system, and then also start introducing some metrics into the design system in order to get a better understanding of what's going on and informed decision making. Now, at first glance, these three things may seem a little bit unrelated, but I've outlined in a very large comment to Tori why I think that these things are related. So here we go. So Tori, so the way I described it initially was, when I'm trying to understand the maturity of a component, I want to see like a rating for the maturity, how much the component has been used, and update and iteration data, so that I can understand how mature the component is, how often it's used, and by what teams, and how much it's been refined and by what teams. And by understanding the distribution of the teams that have actually contributed towards that product, that component, you also start to get a little bit of an idea of whether there's potentially any bias towards how the components have been framed. But that's not like a critical thing, but it's potentially an interesting area to investigate. So Tori responded sort of asking, why is this sort of stuff important? And generally, my thinking is, if I was to consider what are the factors that have an impact on, we don't need to call it maturity, but the maturity of a component, or the sophistication of a component, or the completeness of a component, whatever you want to call it. If we were to try and systematize that in some way, so we can either get one number, or we can start using data to inform like the way that we get our flows. What are the attributes that make up a mature component? So firstly, I sort of said functionality is one. So basically, what can the component do based on the potential for what it could do? Like an example of this would be, what does a table just have a table at the moment? Can you sort it? Do we plan to have it sorted? All that sort of stuff. Usage, how much is this component being used and where? This tells us a lot about potentially areas where we can cluster teams together around a particular working group in the product. For example, like data visualization. There's a number of teams across ops and secure and dev, and we touch on a number of different components. And from there, we've established some working teams around data visualization in general. Does it have documentation? So how up to date is the documentation? What's the quality of the documentation like? Iteration, how much is the work has gone into this component? How many iterations has it been through? Can we see a timeline of how iterations have been made, and maybe some of the design decisions that have gone into that? All of this wouldn't be possible in most design systems, but all the stuff that we're working on is trackable within GitLab issues. So there's a tremendous amount of potential here as GitLab to push design systems further in this respect. Research, tying together research that's happened, solution validation around components to this, and seeing whether some components have been validated or not. And then accessibility. So like how accessible is the component? Is it complying with standards? And I'm not sure how valuable it would be, but potentially you could take these attributes, quantify them in some way, and then sort of create a single maturity score, and then bands of that score could give you whether a component is very mature, not so mature, whatever it may be. But ultimately, what I think is important is breaking down what we define as maturity within our components, such as these things, is what I think. And then thinking about how can we better track these different dimensions in order to better inform our decision making. So for example, the use of this would be just helping people understand whether they should be using components, helping to spot gaps in when and where components are used, or where we could contribute ourselves, giving us more data to measure the impact of our design system on, or the impact of our contributions on the design system, and also giving us more data to start automating some of these processes as well, and thinking about how a change in the product or a change in PJs sort of interact and correspond to each other. So my general thinking is this is like a really interesting area. This is considering a design system not just as a library of artifacts and the way they're structured and how it has an impact on the product. It's also thinking about what are the processes, how do we systematize the processes between our pajamas value stream and our product stage group value stream in order to make design more effective, into order to drive consistency, transparency, whatever it may be. So that's like the overview of my thinking so far. I haven't really created any designs or anything around that, but I'd love to sort of get your feedback on whether what I've said resonates, if there's anything unclear, and whether I'm trying to boil the ocean.
I had left a comment in the agenda, but I had also made the comment in the issue itself that I don't understand the context of maturity in the case of an atom, for example, like a button. Like it's a button, it's got a color, it's got some words. Like how mature is that? I don't understand the scale of maturity for that. But moving that up to like the organism level, like I said, a table, a search bar, like that makes more sense to assign maturity and lifespan, longevity, and understanding how it matches all those, items you labeled, like accessibility and all these other things. So I would say my focus would be not so much on the specific atoms of the component library, which I think there might be too many, and more so the focus on the organism objects that are more shared across the organization, like specifically the search bar, right? That really has some weird behavior. It's not necessarily consistent across the organization or its use cases in particular applications. So definitely I would make the case to use that as a scale for this concept of maturity.
But through like atomic design, that search bar also contains atoms anyway. So
Yeah.
Surely you'd need to understand how, let's not use mature or anything, how sophisticated or how built out these atoms are within your organism to inform the level of sophistication and maturity of that organism itself.
Yeah, but I still think I still think it applies, like, right? So how would you define the sophistication of a button or a toggle, right? It does one thing, it switches right or left, for example, for toggle, and it might have a color. Like
Sure.
there's nothing more to add or refine to that behavior. What you're looking to refine or, I guess, polish would be the applications for that which would be the argument for the organism, where what you're sticking that into. So for example, why did you use a toggle when perhaps the radio button would have been the better choice? And that would be the iteration, that would be the refinement, that would be the accessibility, and that would be the sophistication of the object. And that could
So
define the maturity.
I think what's important here is to sort of go back to what are the attributes that make up maturity or sophistication, whatever it may be. And what you talked about there. So we're just talking about maturity at different levels of abstraction. So we're talking about at the level of the region, level of the object, or level of the component. And you sort of talked a little bit about usage right there. And I think the more foundational the components that we have, the more stable they will be in terms of maturity. They're not going to be fluctuating because they'll be quite high in usage, and they'll have been tested out quite dramatically in terms of the research that they've had. And they're not going to be changing all that much because they're the fundamental things. But if you think about buttons, recently we did have a discussion in the last couple of months where we had all these different colors of buttons for the primary buttons and the secondary and the tertiary. And we have modified that to strip away a number of colors and just having warnings and info and so on. And we've also modified the difference between tertiary, secondary, and primary buttons as well. So even on something as simple as button, we still have this history of how it's transformed, and these combine together with other things to create larger scale things like search bars or whatever. But we have this overview anyway at the sort of atom level. So yeah. But I understand your point. I think what this as I sort of alluded to at the start, Susie sort of talked about, do we have the right word for maturity here? Then you just go into the philosophy of what is maturity? Why are we doing these things?
Exactly. That was my I guess my primary focus on that.
Yeah.
And then going back to the button argument is like, yeah, totally, we iterated on that. But again, it's still a button, right? It only does one thing versus like an object that's built up of a number of pieces. And that was my counter argument to all of this, is that just having something that does on or off or one action really can't give some sort of expression of maturity or sophistication. The refinement, just to play devil's advocate, the refinement of changing tertiary, secondary, all these multiple iterations that we had before, I think that just comes normally, part of the refinement we're doing, but I don't think it falls on a scale of maturity, more just accessibility. But again, like I said, it's just we're arguing about definition of what maturity means.
Yeah, I agree. But I suppose if we take out the word maturity and we say, would it be useful to have a little bit of data about the usage of where these components are? Would that then be sort of a different question for you, or would that be like, do you think it's sort of boiling the ocean to know where in the product components are being used and how much at that level of abstraction of the atom?
I think it's been useful for me to find some examples alongside the components. Like I was looking at one this morning, Michael, Lee, and I were talking about whether or not to use a primary button in a specific location. And then you go to pajamas and there's a specific example saying like, in settings, each one might have its own context and require a primary button. And I was like, there it is. There's the answer to our question. It's right there. So to some degree, getting to see usage consolidated into a single point without having to like dig through GitLab to look for examples is helpful, because sometimes GitLab's not a good example. It's just hasn't been updated yet.
Yeah, that's definitely something I would agree with. Like I'd always have to go digging around, like where does this example live? Like I just spent this morning looking for a case of that. Like I don't understand where it's in the documentation. I have to go find it in the UI.
right? Or even just like we deprecated success and warning buttons, and we're gonna for a while have success and warning buttons throughout the application. That's not the pattern we want to do in the future. Pajamas at least helps us document what the correct behavior should be while we go fix the rest of the app or update the rest of the app.
I have a question. So I'm going to skip the one that I wrote in the agenda, but basically, okay, I have two questions. Which one's more important? So who would track how much work has been done on each component outside the foundations team? Like how would that benefit everyone else, I guess? How do you see it benefiting everyone else?
Sure. So the typical workflow that you get for contributing a component to pajamas is you have your stage groups value stream, where this is like the typical, you break down an issue, XYZ, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the design stage within there. And then you identify a need within the design stage that we need to add a component or update a component. So for example, I did like a path, and then that goes into the pajamas project, where you work with other people to create this component. And then you put it into the GitLab UI project. And that's where they actually build out the component that would then be used within the stage group value stream. So that's like the typical pattern of how the need for a component arises. And I've forgotten your question. What was the question?
Oh, I forgot mine too. Oh, like what would be the benefit of tracking kind of the history of the component?
Right. So what you get is when creating these issues around components, you will tag the component with a badge which says component path or component whatever. So part of the process of this is tagging the component, which means that anything that has been worked on that has been tagged with that badge then comes into the timeline, and you could pull in that data into our design system of things that have been worked on and contributed towards this particular thing. So within those issues, people may have some pretty valuable discussions around why have we decided to make the component this color? Why have we decided to make the spacing this much? And it gives a little bit more context of the use cases that have shaped the reason for why this component exists. So it provides that sort of additional context and background that you can dive into. It's not the front level of a component that you want to be seeing because it's a lot of data. But if you wanted to deep dive into like, why is a component like this, you could sort of look through the entire history and timeline.
I could see that being perhaps, this is just maybe a scenario, that being kind of a daunting task to sift through a lot of the issues, just seeing where it came from, who's using what. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it could basically get the GitLab curse where there's just so much data, it's hard to track what's going on. But for example, you could just do just a search here with label equals component badge. Search for that, and then I can see all the issues that are open that are looking to contribute towards that, all the issues that are closed that have contributed towards that component right there. So in the grand scheme of things, this badge component has 9 of these issues in total, and if we just sort of manage the way this appears or transitions to this sort of list here, I think it could be potentially manageable. But yeah, I understand there's a potential for information overload that we don't want to introduce into our already verbose design system.
I think this would be a really great discussion to bring up in one of like the foundation's office hours. I think that'd be a cool forum to have this. I think my reflection question is just, if we got to this dream you're envisioning, how would it change your workflow as a designer at GitLab?
So I want to automate as much stuff as possible in my workflow when I'm divvying up the strategic design that I want to be doing, like the direction design, versus the more tactical design where potentially a front-end developer could just look through the design system and just apply it and then just look at me for review. I wonder, could this data be used to automate some of my processes and to check on whether something is being applied properly as well? If you think about in DevOps, they've run a number of tests within Verify through pipelines to understand, will this integrate properly into the environment? Will this work properly with XYZ? Will any bugs pop up? Whatever it may be. And I just wonder if there's like a design equivalent of, are you applying these components correctly? If not, how should they be applied? Where can I look into doing that? So I can sort of read a little bit more and sort of using that as a way to automate some of the touch points that I would be doing as a designer with the front end PMs.
Yeah, this makes me think of that one component you and I were talking about with the date picker a little bit. Because there are instances in our GitLab environment where we constrain the date range to a specific window because of performance related issues in the backend. That's not captured in pajamas today, but it's come up for me. It's come up for you. Yeah, that's an interesting thought of how do we make sure we present that information so people can make good decisions without necessarily needing a designer to give them the answer.
Yeah, another simple example is how many instances are people using the blue primary button in the interface compared to just the secondary button? If so, should that inform how I decide to use a blue primary button or whatever it may be? So starting to not necessarily completely rely on data to drive all your decisions, but to inform some more of your decisions. So extra data points to inform how you should be deploying design in order to improve consistency and clarity across the product, but also data to inform how you automate processes as a designer.
Yeah, I love that thinking. Yeah, I was thinking currently like the way that I view pajamas is just as a system to help me identify like what's old and new and equate like what have we migrated. Like there's this big effort to move out of HAML and all these older components. So it helps me keep that in check, which kind of goes back to Amanda's original questions, like what are people tracking with other design systems? Most often I see them as a visual illustration or a documented illustration of what have we migrated to the new front end, what should designers be using versus what developers are using. And I do think we track some of it, obviously like, through our OKRs, like have we updated all the buttons? Like we have to have that foundationally before we can understand like how many primary buttons are being used in the app, because if they're not all on view, well, we're not ready to start evaluating which variants are being used. So baby steps, I guess we could maybe get to that point. But I imagine we're going to need to see a lot more complete badges, complete in the sense that it exists in pajamas like in Figma and it exists in Vue before we'll be ready to start doing some of those metrics. But I think that'd be an interesting evolution of like once we've hit, I don't know, some like 80%, 90% coverage of the library, how then do we evaluate the success of our design system? It's a great question.
Cool. I've taken up a lot of time here, so in the last 4 minutes to